Hello. Today I'm going to go over the over natural selection and that's the different types of selection and speciation. So we're going to cover a lot in this video. And so the first thing that we need to remember is that Charles Darwin, he was the first scientist really to introduce the idea of natural selection. And natural selection is just a mechanism of how evolution could occur. So remember, evolution is just simply the changes that occur in a population. And natural selection is the idea that organisms best adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce and pass on those beneficial traits to their offspring. Another word for natural selection is survival of the fittest. So, how does natural selection lead to change? What does it look like? So, we can imagine, say, for example, and this is an example of natural selection, we had a population of beetles, and there was a variety or variation in the beetle color. Remember, variation are just differences. And so, say there was a drought that caused the ground and the trees to become brown. So, those brown beetles would have an advantage or an adaptation, and they would be able to better survive better. They would be able to survive better than the green beetles because the brown beetles would be able to blend in with the environment, and the green beetles would stand out, and they would get eaten faster by the predators or the birds. So the brown beetles would be more camouflage and therefore survive and reproduce and pass on their adaptations to their offspring. And so over many generations or after a long period of time, eventually the whole population of beetles would be brown. So this is an example of natural selection and how it could occur. Natural selection explains many amazing creatures. So you have the venomous coral snake and you have the scarlet king snake. They look very similar, but one is harmless and one is deadly. And so that's an example of mimicry. Mimicry is when you just have one organism that copies or mimics, looks like another organism. And the one like that organism would be harmless. The other organism that they look like would be deadly. Another example of natural selection would be the rothole tree frog. It lives on moss-covered trees. And you can see from this picture that it's very hard to see where the frog is because it blends in so well with its environment. So it has an adaptation that allows the frog to blend in and not get eaten or not be easily seen by the prey. And so these are both examples of natural selection. Okay, so natural selection can change a population in several ways. Directional selection, disruptive selection, and stabilizing selection are the three types of ways that natural selection can change a population in the three types of selection. And so we have different graphs to represent the different types of selection. So the first type of selection, the first graph goes with directional selection, and it's selection towards a single direction. Stabilizing selection is selection towards the average. And so it selects against the extreme. So the population starts off, this red, and then eventually after the stabilizing selection, it ends up the blue because most of the average size individuals in the population are selected for. And this first one, directional selection, you have a population that starts off one way or one trait, and then it ends up a different trait. And we're going to go through different examples of these types of selection. And then disruptive selection is selection against the average. And so it starts off with this red shaped curve, but it ends up being the blue shaped curve. So one trait, one extreme version of the trait, and the other extreme version of the trait, they're both favored in this type of environment or this type of selection. All right, so here's the graph for directional selection. So you see it selects against one extreme version of the trait, or selects for one extreme version of the trait. So the population starts off as one trait and then it ends up as another trait, and that's directional selection. And then so directional selection, say for example, an original population of beetles is about 50% light green and 50% dark green. What happens if the beetle population moves into a new environment with dark soil and vegetation? So if the new environment is dark soil and has dark vegetation, which type of beetle is going to be more likely to survive in that environment? Will it be the light green or the dark green? Okay, so it's going to be the dark green. So the dark green beetle is going to be able to better survive in this environment. And so the color of the beetle population is going to change. It's going to change from light green to mostly dark green. And so this would be an example of directional selection. All right, so the next type of selection is stabilizing selection. And we said before that stabilizing selection is when you have selection against both extremes of versions of the trait, and it selects for the medium, the mean, the average. So say, for example, an original population of beetles is about 50% light green, 50% dark green. What happens if the beetle population moves into a new environment covered in medium green colored ferns? So what's going to happen? So in this environment, is the light green beetles are not going to do too well in this environment, and the dark green beetles are not going to do too well in this environment. But the beetles that are kind of in between, not too light, not too dark, they are the ones that are going to flourish. And so the graph is going to look like this, where you're going to have most of the population be in between light and dark. And this would be an example of stabilizing selection, when it selects for the average or the mean. All right, so the final type of selection we're going to talk about is disruptive selection. Disruptive selection is when it's selection against the average or the mean. And so the two extreme versions of the trait are favored in disruptive selection. So an original population, we got that same original population where 50% is light green, 50% is dark green. What happens if the beetle population moves into a new environment covered in both light green moss and dark green shrubs? So if you have an environment and it has an area for the light green, it has the light green moss, and then it has the dark green shrubs. So the light green beetles are good because they're going to be able to blend in the light green moss portion. And then the dark green beetles will be good because they'll be able to just blend in the dark green shrubs. So both the light green and the dark green are going to be favored in this type of environment. But the medium, like those beetles that are in between, not too light, not too dark, they will not be okay in this environment. All right, so speciation. So speciation is the formation of a new species through the process of evolution. And so it says, can the process of evolution, can the process of natural selection cause enough changes to accumulate that a new species develop? That answer is yes. How do you know if this has happened? You know a new species has occurred if you have two organisms that can no longer mate, then you know that a speciation has occurred. And so in this example, you can see that you have 3 different species of fruit flies. So a speciation, so right here is when they branched off and you got one type of fruit fly and another type of fruit fly, and then another point where you're seeing a new species is right here. So now you have the 3 species of fruit flies that have evolved. All right, so these are the things that are listed below are some of the ways that speciation can occur. And I'm just trying to move my screen over. Okay, so speciation can occur through geographic isolation. So two organisms that normally mated, if there was like a road or highway built and they can no longer mate, then over time speciation is going to occur. Physical barriers like body size could lead to speciation. Errors in cell division could lead to new species. Mutations could also lead to new species. And then mating time and preferences can lead to new species. So these things below, all of these things can lead to a new species being formed. All right, and so there are two different theories of how speciation, the rate of speciation occurs. And so some scientists believe that speciation occurred through the process of gradualism. Other scientists believe that speciation occurred through punctuated equilibrium. And so basically, gradualism model, scientists believe that species have diverged slowly. So you can see like this is gradually, this bird is changing gradually. So species diverge slowly. The change occurs in small steps. You see this occurring typically in large populations and environments that are stable. Punctuated equilibrium model is a model where you have species diverge rapidly, so changing rapidly. The change occur in bursts, followed by long periods of no change. And this typically occurs in small populations and in environments that are rapidly changing. All right, so here is a model of gradualism and then punctuated equilibrium. So two models of how these birds have evolved. The top is gradualism, the bottom is punctuated equilibrium. All right, so there are different patterns that evolution can follow depending on pressures in the environment. So divergent evolution is where you have, these are different models of how you can illustrate the different types of patterns of evolution. So divergent evolution, these organisms, they have a common ancestor right here, but then they have just become different over time. Convergent, these organisms are not related closely. They don't have a common ancestor, but they start looking similar due to living in similar environments. And then coevolution is just when the two organisms, they have evolved over the same time period. So I'm just going to give you guys more details about each. So divergent evolution is related species becoming more and more different due to living in different environments. So Darwin's finches is a famous example of divergent evolution. And so all these birds, they have a common ancestor, and this is the common ancestor right here. But because they live in different environments and eat different types of food, they have become different over time. And then, so divergent evolution explains the formation of homologous structures, and it suggests that these organisms have a recent common ancestor. And we've talked about what homologous structures are. Homologous structures are just structures that are built the same way, they have the same anatomy, but they have a different function. And then we have convergent evolution, is when unrelated species become more and more similar due to living in similar environments, even if living across the world from one another. So you have the antifreeze proteins in Arctic and Antarctic fish. These fish are not related. But they have similar proteins because they live in similar environments. Another example of convergent evolution would be sharks and dolphins. Sharks have, and dolphins, they look very similar. They have similar adaptations. They are not closely related. They don't have a recent common ancestor, but because they live in similar environments, they have evolved similar adaptations. And then so convergent evolution explains the formation of analogous structures. And we talked about analogous structures in a previous video. Analogous structures are just structures that have similar functions, but they don't have similar anatomy. So these organisms don't have a common ancestor or a recent common ancestor, and they're not closely related, but they do have similar structures because they live in similar, they live in similar environments. Or they need to do, like, they both fly, so they both have wings, but they are not closely related. And then finally, coevolution is the simultaneous evolution of two unrelated species due to their close interaction or relationship. So bats and flowers are tropical regions. They have evolved